Hey guys, and welcome to another video talking about how we can use systems of equations to model and describe some more real-world situations. And so in this example, when you fly to go visit your parents, you need to get a taxi from the airport to your parents' home. And so you Google some taxi companies in the area, and you find that the two most reasonable ones are Discab and Vicky's Taxi. And so the prices for the two are a little bit different. Discab has a $20 pickup fee. That's how much it just costs to have a cab pick you up in the first place. And then it costs $22.25 per mile. Vicky's Taxi has a more expensive pickup fee, almost twice as much, but it costs less per mile. Something to keep in mind. Ultimately, we're going to ask ourselves, well, which taxi should we use? But to get there, let's start by creating an equation for each of these taxi companies describing the cost. And I'm going to use the variables x and y again. And our independent variable x, I think, is going to be the number of miles that are driven in this trip. And I'm just going to say number of miles. And the dependent variable in this case is going to be the cost of that taxi trip. Okay, so Discab, which we will do in red, so they are a $20 pickup fee. So I'm going to call that equation y equals at least 20 to start. That's our pickup fee before we drive any miles. And then it costs $2.25 per mile. Whereas Vicky's, which we're going to do in green, their cost starts at $35. That's the pickup fee when x is 0, when it's been 0 miles yet. And then it costs an additional $1.50 per mile. Okay, so we've got these two equations to describe these two different costs for the two different companies. But now let's ask some specifics. So what if your parents' home were exactly 15 miles from the airport? How much would it cost? Which would you choose? And again, we're going to assume that the only factor you're considering is cost. That they have the exact same types of cars, and the quality of the drivers is just the same, and the customer service is the same, and it's just the cost that's going to determine which one we use. So for Discab, we are going to figure out how much it costs for that 15-mile ride. So, well, $20 for the pickup fee, $2.25 for each of those 15 miles. And so I'm going to use a calculator to figure this out. And we find that the total cost is going to be, right, $20 for the pickup, plus the mileage costs $33.75. So the total cost is $53.75 if you were going to take Discab to your parents' home if it's 15 miles away. For Vicky's Taxi, let's see how much it costs. Well, they have a more expensive pickup fee, if you remember, but it's less expensive per mile. So let's see which one ends up being cheaper. Well, for Vicky's Taxi, we're going to now spend $1.50 per mile times those 15 miles. And so their total cost is going to be $35 for the pickup plus $22.50 for the mileage for a grand total of $57.50. And so, oh wow, it's actually pretty close. But for 15 miles, it makes sense for us to choose Discab because it is cheaper than Vicky's Taxi. Okay, good to know. Now, what happens if it's a slightly longer trip to get to your parents' home? What if instead of 15 miles, it's 60 miles to the airport? And I'm beginning to think that at 60 miles, it's probably going to be Vicky's, which is going to be less expensive because it's only $1.50 per mile. Whereas Discab, it's more per mile. But let's go ahead and just make sure that our hunch is correct by doing some calculations. So for Discab, a 60-mile trip would cost $20 for your pickup and $2.25 a mile for each of these 60 miles. And so we find the total cost is going to be $20 for the pickup plus yowza, $135 for the actual mileage for a grand total of $155 on the dot for that 60-mile trip with Discab. Okay, now let's try out Vicky's and see what happens with Vicky's. So, Vicky's cost for a 60-mile trip is going to be $35 for the pickup and then $1.50 for each of those 60 miles. So the cost is going to be 35 plus 90. Oh wow, this is going to be a lot cheaper. It is 125. So, we see that for this longer journey, Vicky's is now the much cheaper option. Whereas for the shorter journey, Discab was a better option. And I think this was mostly because it had that lower pickup fee. Even though it was, it cost more for every mile, the low pickup fee was what made this cheaper in the beginning, but it's the low mileage fee that made Vicky's cheaper at the end. Of course, this begs the question, is there ever a time when these two are going to cost exactly the same amount? If your parents lived X miles away, would it ever be the case that the cost would be the exact same for the two? Well, we've got our two cost functions here. We've got our cost function for Discab and our cost function for Vicky's Taxi, and all we have to do to answer this question is, well, let's set them equal to one another. And we end up with the equation 20 plus 2.25x equals 35 plus 1.50, or 1.5x. And all we need to do is solve this equation, and we will find the x value, or in mileage, for which these two are exactly the same. So let's do it. So I think I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides of the equation. We've got 2.25x equals 15 plus 1.5x. I'm going to subtract 1.5x from both sides. We end up with 0.75x equals 15. Or now I might go ahead and you can divide by 0.75, but you can also rewrite this as 3/4 x. Oh, equals 15. So I'm going to multiply both sides of this equation by 4/3. You're going to end up with the exact same answer either way you go, and you end up with 20 miles. So if the ride were exactly 20 miles, then these two should cost the exact same amount. And if you were to substitute 20 miles into either one of these equations, you would find that the cost would be $65. So what we say is that for a 20-mile ride, Discab and Vicky's Taxi are going to cost the exact same amount. How much are they going to cost? $65. All right, now our ultimate question is, which service should you use? Well, I think it totally depends on how far away your parents live. Maybe you could use your intuition to figure out when you should go with Discab and when you should go with Vicky's, but let's formally show how to find this with equations and inequalities and graphs and tables of values as well. So remember that here in red we've got Discab, that's their cost function, and here in the right in green we've got Vicky's cost function. And so if you want to find out when Discab is cheaper, all you got to do is solve this inequality. Right? Find out when this cost is less than this cost. And if you were to go ahead and you were to find that cost function, you would find that x is less than 20. And that means that as long as the trip is less than 20 miles, then Discab is going to be cheaper. Why? Because the cheaper pickup fee outweighs the fact that it costs more per mile. Of course, if the ride were exactly 20 miles, then the two would be the exact same cost. And if you want to find out when Vicky's is going to be the cheaper option, well, all you need to do is solve this inequality. You're asking, when is this cost, the cost of Vicky's, going to be less than the cost of Discab? And what you will find in this case is that x is greater than 20. And so, if your ride is more than 20 miles, you should go with Vicky's. Why? Because of this cheaper cost per mile. Even though it costs more to pick up, it's cheaper per mile than it is for Discab. And of course, I want us to be really comfortable doing this with equations and inequalities, but I also want to feel comfortable discussing this with regard to a graph. So, I have here on Desmos a graph of this situation, where on the horizontal axis we've got the number of miles for the trip, and the vertical axis we've got the cost of the taxi. So here's Discab. That 20 is the pickup fee, and it costs $2.25 per mile. That's the slope of this line. Vicky's Taxi costs a bit more to begin with, $35 pickup fee, but it costs less per mile. The slope is only 1.5, meaning that eventually the cost of Discab is going to catch up to Vicky's Taxi. And for a 20-mile trip, they're exactly the same cost, $65 each. And we see for any trip less than 20 miles, it's best to go with Discab. But for any trip more than 20 miles, forever and ever, it's going to be best to go with Vicky's Taxi. And the vertical distance between these two lines tells you how much more or less expensive it is to choose one or the other taxi company. And of course, we could confirm this all as well with the table of values. I just want us to be really comfortable understanding how all of these different representations relate to one another and being able to use any of them to discuss these real-world situations.